Okay, in this chapter, we're going to talk about consequentialism. So, this is another theory of ethical action. And what these folks are arguing is that what makes the act morally right or wrong is its consequences. So, the nature of the act and the motives are not important. Theorists who subscribe to this include Jeremy Bentham, who is the founder of utilitarianism, and John Stuart Mill. So they're going to attempt to lay down an objective principle that can help determine if a particular action is ethically right or wrong. And they refer to this as the principle of utility. So Mill refers to this as the greatest happiness principle. And it says that action is right insofar as it tends to produce the greatest happiness for everyone affected. So if we find ourselves having a choice about which action or policy to follow, we should choose the one that gives the best overall consequences for all concerned. This theory rejects the idea that actions are right because God says they are or because they're inherently moral. So Mill argues against the subjugation of women and says it cannot be justified by arguing that these practices seem natural or appropriate. They also say that morality is simply an attempt to bring about as much happiness as possible. And this, like our other ideas, were very revolutionary at the time they were proposed. So one thing they talk about here is this pleasure-pain principle. And hedonism is the idea that the only intrinsic good is pleasure. And Mill was criticized for this idea early on. But basically what this comes down to is an action is right if it produces the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people affected. So what we do then is we perform what's called a hedonistic calculus. So utilitarianism emphasizes the effects of an action. So if an action produces more benefit than harm, it's an ethical action. But let's think about this. Hitler may have believed he was acting from a genuine desire to improve life for the German people, but his acts generated more pain. So these philosophers are going to argue that action can be measured. And the hedonistic calculus has 7 elements, 2 of which are the intensity of the pleasure and its duration. So this allows the amount of pleasure or pain of an act to be measured. And it doesn't need to be strictly followed for every moral judgment. So the obvious problem here is how do we accurately predict our consequences? And if we really want to perform a thorough analysis, it's very time consuming. One benefit of utilitarianism is it doesn't require us to ignore what may be good for ourselves. So we should try to bring about the greatest balance of good over bad that we can for all people. So to summarize this, actions are determined right or wrong by the virtue of their consequences. Right produces the best consequences. The only thing that matters is the amount of happiness or unhappiness produced, and everyone's welfare is equally important. So utilitarians conduct their lives according to 2 main principles. Be concerned about the actual effects of your choices and try to predict outcomes, but realize luck plays a role. And because utilitarianism is a benevolent moral doctrine, they want to make the world a better place for all. We want to increase the amount of happiness and well-being for everyone throughout the world. So what's the difference between pleasure and happiness? Pleasure is generally linked to a particular activity or feeling, so we think of this in terms of the body. Happiness is more of a state of mind and less directly related to the body. Miller also argues that some pleasures are higher or more important than others. So pleasures of the intellect, of feelings, imagination, and moral sentiment have more importance than those that are merely sensations. Act consequentialists argue that we should ask ourselves, in relation to each separate act, whether or not it promotes the greatest good. So individual decisions then are made case by case. They also don't consider themselves bound by rules like the ones we talked about under deontological theory, where we're talking about stealing or lying. So what are some objectives to this? Well, it's very time consuming, and as mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to predict the consequences. Utilitarians respond to this, though. They say they follow basic rules of thumb that incorporate past experience, and what society considers a good outcome usually produces the best consequence for everyone. And these are not moral absolutes, but really summaries of what has occurred previously. Rules consequentialism says keeping to certain rules produces better consequences than trying to determine what should follow from every individual action. So we have a duty to speak the truth, even when doing so causes pain. Following rules is generally the best way to achieve general good. So an act is right only if it is in agreement with a rule that would maximize overall net happiness for all people affected. Criticism of this, though, is that they take rules to be absolute and without exception, then they have abandoned consequentialism. So if we do that, we're getting back to that idea of absolutism. So this approach to public policy would require government officials to base their actions and programs on the most accurate and detailed information and what are the likely results of any alternatives. So punishment is justified if the pain and suffering to those who are punished is outweighed by the benefits of the punishment. Those benefits cannot be achieved with less suffering or at a lower cost to those being punished. So what are some arguments criticizing utilitarianism? Well, it's incompatible with the ideal of justice, according to which we should treat people fairly, taking into account their individual needs. So let's think about a race riot. If we sentence an innocent man because it will stop the race riots, if we apply utilitarianism, the best consequences would actually be achieved by lying and sentencing this innocent man. It's also inconsistent with the notion that people have rights that may not be infringed upon simply because we would get good results. So, for example, there was a case in which an officer circulated photos of this woman named Miss York while she was undressed. The men received great pleasure, but that really infringes upon her dignity. Criticisms also say that utilitarianism makes a mistake in claiming that consequences are the only thing that matters. So, maybe you told a friend you would go out, but you could get more work done if you blow her off, right? If you don't follow through on those plans. It also eliminates any distinction between things we have to do because they're morally required and supererogatory actions, although not strictly required, are still praiseworthy. This is a moral ethic that requires us to subordinate everything to the greatest good, right? And give no priority to our own interests. So giving away all your money would be good for other people, but is that really good for you? And is that a good rule to follow? We also want to remember that under this idea, every person's life and interest rank equally. So that requires us to give up special relationships. So would a parent, an example here would be the parent who allows a child to burn in a building because another person is rescued has more potential value. Well, these theorists have a response to this criticism. They said, these aren't very realistic, okay? And they also counter by introducing rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. In terms of the race riot, are we really better off by, as a society, by punishing and sentencing this innocent man? Their final argument is sort of like, so what? Why should we assume our feelings are correct? And why should we reject a rational theory because it conflicts with our feelings? Okay, so Ben joins the police department, and a long-standing friend in the same department told him that hey, guess what? Now you're only going to have cop friends. No one understands police except police. Ben felt uncomfortable about this and together with his wife made a conscious effort to find friends outside the police force. They succeeded in part because Ben's wife is a teacher and they can make friends there. But Ben found that people did treat him differently when they found out he was a police officer. And they tended to blame him for all the troubles they encountered, and especially for citations they received. To deal with this problem, they decided they wouldn't tell new acquaintances about his job. They said he worked in public relations in the city, and then after they became friends, he would kind of tell them what they really did. This seemed to work out well, and after a while, they've got a good circle of friends. He found that these friends were even willing to, schedule things around what works for them. So if a party was planned, Ben and his wife were contacted first to make sure they'd be available and could get the night off. Ben thought that some of these friends might be recreational drug users, but they always respected his position and never observed him taking drugs. He never observed them taking drugs in his presence. So two friends, Jim and Sandy, invite Ben and his wife to dinner. And when they arrive, Jim gives Ben his favorite drink. He puts on some music, and Ben's wife goes to help Sandy in the kitchen while Ben and Jim sit in the living room. He reaches to put something under his drink, and he sees a wooden box on the coffee table, and he thought it had coasters in it. He opens it, and it has several joints. He puts a lid back on, looks up and sees the fear in Jim's eye. So what should he do? Well, we're going to look at this and evaluate it according to utilitarianism. So again, we have these steps of, is Ben faced with an ethical dilemma? So first, according to utilitarianism, we want to identify all the options. So Ben can arrest Jim, or he can just let it slide. Who are all the people affected by each of these options? So this is going to include Jim and Sandy, Ben and his wife, other friends who are friends of Jim and Sandy, the police department, and the local community. Then we want to think about the harms and benefits. So Jim and Sandy will suffer because they won't be friends with Ben and his wife. Jim might have a criminal conviction. There's no benefits for them. Ben and his wife are going to lose these friends. This might impact other friendships. The police department benefits because they'll be aware that Ben is prepared to follow the law and arrest friends who commit criminal offenses. And the community benefits because it's aware that at least one police officer is not willing to turn a blind eye to evidence of criminal offenses. So under option 2, which is to do nothing or give Jim a warning, we have the following harms and benefits. So he needs to choose the option that produces the most benefits for those affected. It would be necessary to assign values to those harms and benefits. Assuming a greater benefit, greater value to the benefits of the community and the police department, the option producing the most benefits would be to arrest Jim. Okay, and that wraps up utilitarianism.